Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Thanks for joining us for the Fall Forum season. We all yearn for connection and community, but we live at a time when calls for further division along the well-wrought lines of religion, race, ethnicity, caste, and sexuality are pervasive. The ubiquitous yet elusive problem feeds on fears of the other. The diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are undeniably under pressure, and activists narrowly focus on specific and sometimes conflicting communities. We need a new approach, one that encourages us to turn toward one another in unprecedented and radical ways. My guest today is Professor John A. Powell. He's an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, racial identity, fair housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the director of the Othering Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, where he holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion, and is a professor of law, African American studies, and ethnic studies. He's the co-founder of the Poverty and Race Action Council, author of Racing to Justice, and co-author of Belonging Without Othering, How We Save Ourselves in the World, and The Power of Bridging, How to Build a World Where We All Belong. Today, we're going to be talking about an actionable path through bridging that helps us communicate, coexist, and imagine a new story for our shared future where we all belong. John, thank you so much for joining me today. I have been so immersed in your thought and your ideas. In the back page of your book, I just wrote 1,000 questions. Wow. I'm worried that I might keep you here for the next 2 days. You begin the story, The Power of Belonging, with such a powerful story from your childhood. I didn't want you to have to rehearse that if you don't want to, but maybe you could tell us something about your childhood or a story about your childhood that might give us a sense for what took you in this direction.
Well, thanks for having me here, Malcolm. And it's a wonderful institution. I used to come here a lot when I was in college and going to school at Berkeley. And it was really important to me then, and it's still important. And I think, the work I do or try to do is how I think of Grace Cathedral. And so again, thanks for having me here. I grew up in Detroit, and I'm 6 of 9 children. My parents were sharecroppers into their early adulthood, and then they moved to Detroit about 1943. My father was a Christian minister, so my family was deeply, deeply religious and deeply, deeply practicing, not just doing something on Sunday. And so I was born into that church, and my family was also very tight, like a cocoon. And also very, like I said, very religious, but beyond religion. People used to come and congregate at our house. So there were 11 of us, 9 children, 2 adults, but the house always had at least 20 people. Just, people coming from the south and stopping. And the teachings of the church was that if you weren't baptized, not as a Christian, but in that particular church, so if you get baptized in another Christian church, in Grace, for example.
Right, in this denomination,
yeah,
right.
You're going to hell.
Yeah. Sorry, everybody. That's the bad news.
Yeah, and I said, wait a minute, that's bad news.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, so basically at 11 years old, I asked in church about that. The minister was speaking, it wasn't my father. And at the end of the service, people said, do you have any questions? And I stood up. And it's funny because I was 11 years old, and I didn't realize until later that in those 11 years I had spent at the church, I'd never seen anyone stand up and ask a question. They always said, do you have any question? And no one ever asked a question. And I'm 11, so I don't know what rhetorical questions.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That's a rhetorical question.
But the minister was very calm, and he said, okay, Brother Powell, what's your question? And I said, what's going to happen to the Chinese? Yeah. And this is a black church in Detroit. And everybody's like, what?
Yeah.
He said, that's all right. So he took me around different passages of the Bible. And at the end of it, there was no answer he could give. And I never went back to the church. But also it broke my relationship with my family for many years. My mom started working trying to repair it. And in many ways, it changed, I would say, if not broke my relationship with God. Because not only did I leave the church, I left the religious faith that I had been a part of. And so I thought, I'm going to hell too. So that was my early childhood. And in some ways, I think it marked me for the work I do today.
Yeah, and I just think in some ways it's like you may not have known what a rhetorical question was at the age of 11, but there was a way that you could have retreated back into like almost a more inauthentic position, like I'll just go along with it, I'll go along with it. But there was something about your personality that among the 11 people who lived in that house, there was one who was set aside and who was somehow in the depths of your heart, you were okay with you had the strength to be set aside without having it kind of break you.
Well, that's very generous of you to say so. I mean, in my 11, 12, 13 years, I was not feeling very strong. I felt, I literally used to cry myself to sleep. And I remember a conversation I had with God as I understood it. And I said, and it went something like this, I know I could be an asshole.
Yeah, right.
But on this one, it's not about me. I'm not trying, I'm not trying to get over. I just can't be a part of something that would summarily condemn almost 1 billion people going to hell. Now, I started reading when I was, 9 about the world and China and Africa. And so I didn't know any people who were of Chinese origin. But I knew there was a lot of them, and I knew most of them were not Christian. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, I didn't feel very strong. I didn't feel very righteous. I just felt like something I couldn't do. And in many ways, my students oftentimes say, when did you decide to do X? When did you decide to go on this path that you're on? Because they're trying to figure out their own life.
Yeah, right.
They're trying to figure out what they want to do in this crazy world. And I say, I didn't figure it out. I was called. And, we used to talk about callings. I feel like the universe called me and said, whatever. And if you get a call, it's probably a good idea to answer it.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, like there's so many consequences that are a result of that calling and hearing that calling. Right. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like how would you describe your field and what led you to become an expert in it?
Well, in some ways, I guess the idea of creating a world where everyone acknowledged, I think everyone does belong. Let me stay there. And I remind people sometimes and myself that we're literally born attached to another human being. It's not a metaphor. We're literally attached to another human being. Just think about that. In the womb, when we first come out, and then we may cut the umbilical cord, the physical umbilical cord, but we cannot and should not try to cut the spiritual umbilical cord. And I didn't have words for all these things, but this kind of notion of a world where everyone can live with dignity and belonging has been central. And that's my work. And it's come up a number of times. I'll tell you one other story. And it's not that I haven't done some things that I wouldn't want to share with the general public. But when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, and 16, 17 years old, and I'd done relatively well in school. So I get a scholarship to Harvard. My father dropped out of school in the 3rd grade. His mother died, and he had to go to work. He was living in the South. So they don't really understand the sort of formal education process. I don't think anybody does, but they knew Harvard, and so they were very proud. It's like, our son is going to go to Harvard. And I said, no, I'm not going to Harvard. And they're like, what? Why are we not going to Harvard? You got accepted, they gave you a scholarship. I said, they don't allow women in. Yeah. And it's like, so? I have 5 sisters, right? And so, again, to me, just the wrongness of that. And this is 1964, so there wasn't a consciousness around it. It was like, this is the natural order of things, and women can do other things, and they can go to other colleges, and they had all these stories, and I said no. And my parents it's funny telling these stories because my parents were such incredible people. They were like saints. They were like bodhisattvas. And these stories don't always convey that. So my parents said, if you don't go to Harvard, we're not going to help you go to college. Now I'm 16, 17 years old, and I'm old enough and mature enough that financially, I know that financially, my parents can't help me anyway. It's like, okay.
Yeah, right. We're not going to write our check for $0.
Right, exactly. And so I started looking for schools that were, quote unquote, had strong programs, and I was in math and science, that allowed women in. And I landed at Stanford.
Yeah.
So, but the path in trying to, and so that thing of actually not being willing to accept that you can categorically dismiss a group of people, that's my work.
Yeah.
But then try to make that real. So it's not just an idea, it's not just something I say in a book, but it's something that people live. And realizing it's something that we have to keep doing over and over and over and over again. It's not something that, you do it once or you make the statement. It's really an aspiration. It's like love, right? I mean, like, you meet someone, you might marry them. I heard you officiated a wedding this weekend. But then the practice of love is something that happens over and over and over again. And sometimes we forget. It's like, why did I ever hook up with that person?
Yeah. One of my favorite things about the book is I feel like I'm almost, we have the idea of the communion of the saints. But, you mentioned James Baldwin, and you mentioned Joanna Macy, and you mentioned Hans-Georg Gadamer. I mean, there's so many other comrades that are mentioned. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just how the world of reading and books, who are some of your influences, and how that community of people stretched in time and space influenced your thought.
Well, it's interesting. So again, growing up in Detroit, and I'm the youngest male in my family. I just saw my brother. I just went to Detroit and took some of my siblings out to dinner. It was a good idea, but it cost me $1,000.
Oh my gosh!
It was great. It was great. I could afford it. But so in this family, all these siblings and relatives, I like to read, and my kids when they were little, they would say, "So what do you do all day at work?" And I say, "I go to work and I play conceptual Legos.
Yeah.
I take ideas apart and put them back together." Yeah. And that made sense to them, right? And so, in a sense, that's what I've been doing most of my life. It's like not accepting things as they are, but say, can we put something, take it apart, put it back together a different way? And so books help that. And to me, books are just conversations with people. So you read and you're engaging in a conversation. The other person may not be physically there, but hopefully, periodically, they will be physically there. So it's a chance to actually broaden your world. Not just broaden your world in terms of people who live in a different town, but people who lived in a different period, people who are long gone. And so you become part of the conversation. And one of the things I like about writing is that potentially you're part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So after I'm gone, people can still, read about me if they want, or read some of my thoughts. And I recognize that our thoughts are constantly evolving, and we think together. We're co-creating the world. We're co-creating a culture, and that's a beautiful thing. And so in that effort, it's like, what have other people said about this question? So when I was struggling in 10 or 11 or 12 after I left the church, I found existentialism.
Yes.
Which is great. I mean, it's like, and I'm not saying I understood Sartre or Camus or Kierkegaard at 12, but I did read them. And that also made this strange kid in Detroit even stranger. It's like
you and me both. This is the story of my life.
my dad died recently, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful man, and we just had these wonderful conversations. And so, having left the church at 11, one of the things that looms large is death. Right? It's like, what's going to happen to me when I die? Okay, if I don't go to hell, and I don't go to heaven, I don't go to either of those places, are there some other destinations? So those questions came to mind, and still come to mind. So I would try to talk to my dad about it.
Yeah.
What happens to you when you die? And at some point he said, John, can we talk about something else? And again, I remember a date with a young girl. I'm 14, she's probably the same age. And she said, so what do you like to do in your spare time? And I said, read. He said, well, what do you read about? I said, and I had discovered the book, Denial of Death. And I said, death? She said, can you take me home? So the other thing about books, they don't ever leave you, right? They don't say, put me down.
Yeah.
But reading about James Baldwin, reading Kierkegaard, reading Heidegger, watching other people who are struggling with things and doing it in a very sophisticated way was extremely important to me. It just helped frame my own thinking. And I think it just opened up the world. And so I was no longer just living in Detroit. I was living in China. I was living in Africa. I was living in Latin America. And so I think books is really a wonderful medium for actually engaging deeper conversations.
Yeah, and I think that's what I appreciated so much about the book, your books. You had these people who are kind of in the wings, kind of supporting the ideas that you have. But I think the framework is just really powerful too. And it felt to me like it's almost like that itself was like a lifelong project.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can talk a little bit with us, just about the basic vocabulary we need to understand. What is belonging? What is othering? What is bridging? What is breaking? What's a long bridge? What's a short bridge? That kind of framework, and maybe you can kind of give us a sense for it, even though it'd be great to have them all read the book themselves.
So I just went to see my doctor recently, and we're sort of friends, and he wants some advice about writing a book. And I said, so the first thing to think about is, why are you writing it? The second thing to think about is, who's your audience? Who are you talking to? So if you think about, you're in conversation with someone, hopefully conversation with you, Malcolm, with all of you. And it's hard to sort of talk to everybody all the time, right? So I would say, if you think the two books are back there.
So Power, Belonging, and Belonging Without Othering.
The first book, Belonging Without Othering, is really trying to get sort of down and dirty, if you will. And I teach at Berkeley. These students are really brilliant and just smart as a whip. And I try to get them to think very simply. There are things we use, words we use all the time, but we don't really think about what they mean. So the word love, right? What is, you can really spend a lot of time just really digging into what does love really mean. And in fact, I'm doing a talk in a month or so on love. And so I go back and I read, what did the Greeks have to say about love?
Yeah, exactly.
What does the Bible have to say about love? We think of love, and most of us, when we think of love, it's like, that's it. It's like, I'm in love. Okay, I'm not. Or I was, or maybe I will be. But we don't think about all the different ways, all the different things that love mean. Why is it so important in our life? And so part of my writing, especially in the first book, is to try to take these concepts. Because the idea of belonging is actually quite intuitive. We all have a sense of belonging. We all have a sense of wanting to be part of something. We also have a sense of being other. We also know what it means to be shunted, or to be ignored, or to be deliberately misunderstood, or to be told to be quiet. you don't have a voice. So we've all had some experience like that. But then to sort of get down and take those simple ideas and sort of try to understand them. Because ideas, in a sense, are like, you can think of a plant. You sort of think of a tree. You can understand a tree. You can look at a tree. But to really understand a tree, you got to go to a forest. You have to see the tree in its community. You have to see the tree in relationship to all the other plants that are not trees. And when you read about how forests, how the undergirth of forests is sort of integrating and talking to each other and supporting each other, it's like, wow, they have a community, right? And now as we study, it's like the community is extensive. Like they're literally, I'm sure many of you know this stuff, but if there's a fire, the plants communicate for hundreds of miles, and they do things to try to actually. So anyway, the point is that the simple thing of a tree turns out to be really beautifully complex. And so what I try to do in the first book is sort of peel off some of the complexity. So the first book, some people have difficulty with it. Belonging without othering. They say it's kind of dense. My brother, I gave him a copy and I said, so did you read it? He said, I tried. It gave me a headache. And trying to be very careful with words. So not assuming that we all have the same paradigm. Not assuming that we all have the same worldview. So to take time to build all that, it does make it dense. And some people don't have the patience for that, right? And I accept that. So the first book, you could say, is written in part for those who are already in the work and for those who are more comfortable making that deep dive. The second book, and I'll come back to the terms, the second book, The Power of Bridging, is written for people who are more into stories. So let me just take a little step back. The brain is a complicated organism, and it has evolved over time. So the older part of the brain is sometimes called the lizard brain, and the amygdala. And that's the brain that we share with lizards. And that part of the brain also helps regulate and interact with our feelings, especially fear and anxiety. And so when that part of the brain is deeply excited, it knocks the rest of the brain off. So the newer part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala is back here, the prefrontal cortex is right here. And it's reasoning, it's logic, it's probably part of the brain that you're engaging in right now as I talk to you. The prefrontal cortex, again, reasoning, logic, is knocked out when we're very fearful. And so I say to my students, part of the thing you have to learn to do is talk to the lizard. And we don't spend enough time learning lizard language. And I would say, and I can come back to this, President Trump is very fluent in lizard language. He knows how to talk to the lizard. And we get confused because what the lizard listens to is not facts. The lizard doesn't cite studies. The lizard doesn't read footnotes. So when someone's deeply afraid, how do you talk to them? I won't go into any more great detail right now, but I'll say, to some extent, you can think of the lizard as the heart-centered. How do you talk to the heart? How do you connect to someone with the heart? It's different connected with the head and the heart. So belonging is when we sort of experience those connections, when we know we're part of something larger than us, when we can exhale, when we have a place. Belonging, in the best sense of the word, is home. When you're feeling like this is your place, and othering is sort of the opposite of belonging, but not entirely. So there's a big debate in the academy whether you can have belonging without othering. Some people think that if you have a group, an in-group, you have to have an out-group. Logically, that seems to make sense. And even evolutionarily, that may seem to make sense. So people tell stories. So, a lot of times we sort of come to our conclusion and then we look for evidence to support it. So the conclusion is we're tribal. Look at all the evidence that we're tribal. It turns out that that is so fundamentally wrong. To me, once I sort of discovered it, it's like, why didn't I know that earlier? So I'll give you just a 90-second version of it. So first of all, tribes, as they exist for the most part in history, and we think of hunter-gatherers, they were anywhere from 50 to 200 people. They were organized around the people you spent your entire life with every day. It's people you see every day, not occasionally. And you're hunting and gathering, so you're moving. So there's no tribe at that time organized around race, organized around religion, organized around sexual orientation. It was organized around who do you spend your daily life with, right? And it could not be much bigger than a couple of hundred. Some people say they went to 1,000, but it was small. People you see every day. So when we talk about the tribes of white people, or tribes of African Americans, or tribes of Americans, the 330 million people who are Americans. That's not a tribe. That's something fundamentally different than a tribe. What holds that together? So there are 1.5 billion people on the planet that call themselves Christian. There are 1.2 billion people on the planet that call themselves Muslims. That's not a tribe. Most of those people will never see each other. They speak a different language. They live in a different culture. They eat different food. What's holding them together? It's not the same thing that held the tribe together. The reason that's important is that when people say we learn to other from tribalism, it's clearly not true. There's some other mechanism going on that wasn't there 10,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. What's that other mechanism that's going on? And Harari talks about it in his book, Sapien. What he says is that the thing that allowed sapiens, as opposed to other humans like Neanderthals, to create these large groups of collaboration was stories and imagination. We tell stories, and apparently the ability to tell stories and imagination is a skill, capacity that sapiens developed about 70,000 years ago, and it's called the cognitive revolution. And some people say the cognitive revolution broke us off from the biological determinism. That is, we could imagine things that weren't there. We could tell stories and then make them real. And from Harari's perspective, two big stories. One is religion, right? That's a story from, so now you can tell a story. You can tell a story that holds people together, that help define people in terms of their identity, that helps define who belongs. Are there any other big stories? From Harari's perspective, money. Money's a story that most of us believe in. Right?
You did when you paid $1,000 for everybody to have dinner.
So, and the question is, can we tell a story that includes everybody? And I think the answer is yes. And it's certainly not predetermined that we cannot. So I've talked to people about obviously belonging and othering, and people say, yes, but there's some people, I have nothing in common with that person. We don't worship the same God. We don't worship in the same way. We don't eat the same food. We don't agree the same politics. They're urban and I'm rural. And I said, you think you're going to die? Get quiet. Well, that's kind of a rude question. That other person that you just described, they're going to die too. There are these profound things that we share. And so in a sense, and I'll stop by saying this because belonging is not an abstraction. Uh, we used to say, we still say, a circle of human concern with no one outside the circle, with no one outside the circle. And I'll give you one example of that, but then also the critique of it. So there's some fights going on in the United States today. The United States government is taking people and picking up on the streets and then shifting them off to another country and put them in jail. And someone says, you can't do that without giving them a chance to tell their story, a chance to go to a judge or a magistrate and tell their story. We call it due process. Yeah. You could also call it belonging, the right to be heard, the right to tell your story. Now, when that was said, the response from the administration was, these are bad people. They're criminals, they're drug dealers, they're rapists, they hate America, they came into the country illegal, they're members of gangs. See this tattoo on so-and-so's arm? It's a tattoo saying they hate America. You know what the court said? Doesn't matter. They said, due process is something that's accorded to every human being. Not every American, not every nice person, not every kind person, but it's something that's accorded to everyone. That's an amazing thing, and I think it's important to celebrate that, right? Because we have seeds of that, of this extensive belonging throughout our history. We don't always live up to it, but it's something that's there. Yeah. And especially people who are liberal forget that sometimes, that it's not a done deal, but the seeds are there. So can we tell a story? Can we engage in practices that accord people, that recognize that everyone belongs? So going back to the critique of belonging, or the critique of circle of human concern with no one on the outside. And some my friends came and said, why are you limiting it to humans? What about the earth? And they're right. But here's the interesting thing. Human comes from the word humus, which means earth.
Earth, yeah.
So in this, the meaning of humans already anticipates, already acknowledged. We forgot that humans means of the earth. We forgot that. And so can we remember that? So this is also why words are important, right? Is that, yes, we are of the earth. And when we live and die well, we recognize that. And I'll stop by just saying, I had a friend who's urban gardener, Robert Alexander, died a few months ago. And we had this memorial service. And one of the things his daughter did was to have him compost it. Not cremate it, but compost it. And she took the composted part of his body and planted trees. And I have a tree now. And so just to me, just so that the circle of life was sad but incredibly beautiful. Yeah. We belong. And so part of the challenge is, again, not a metaphor, but how do we actually practice that in terms of our courts, in terms of how we structure housing, in terms of how we worship, in terms of how we eat, in terms of how we think about healthcare. We need help with that. But first is just an acknowledgement that it's already there. It's just to realize we put all these things in the way. And one of the ways to do that is to bridge. So bridging is predicated on the notion that once we have these apparent differences, and they're apparent, the dean of Yale wrote a book called What Difference Does a Difference Make? There are no natural differences. There's no natural other. It's something we make up. But once we make it up, it seems really real. And then we organize our lives so it becomes real in consequences. We don't live in the same neighborhood. We don't go to the same school. We don't go to the same church. We don't talk to each other. So then we have to figure out a way of correcting that. And bridging is how we do it. Bridging at its core is recognizing another person's humanity, is recognizing another person's suffering, it's recognizing another person's story. It's not saying you agree with the story. It's not saying you like the person. It's not saying you're going to vote with the person. In fact, you may be struggling, even fighting the person. But in the fight, you hold on to the person's humanity. And in that holding on to the person's humanity, you're also willing to be curious. Okay, you disagree with me, but tell me why. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you're afraid of. So the heart of bridging is connecting to the heart and empathetic listening.
Yeah, and what I liked too is, you make a differentiation between short bridging and long bridging. And short bridging is just like, not all Christians agree what to believe about sexuality, how to treat human sexuality. And, there may be huge disagreements, and it might seem like it's World War III, but, there's a huge amount that we already believe in. We're already pretty much, in some way, we're kind of committed to be in conversation with each other. So that's when short bridging is happening, when people all are part of that same group. But then the long bridging is when you talk about people who are really on the outside of that group. And one of the biggest problems that we have, I think, is that some forms, as you write, some forms of belonging are kind of are built on othering another group. And so you write in your book about just how if you're a politician who's saying that the other party is absolutely the devil incarnate, and then it's hard to make a deal with them without feeling like you're betraying that group. Right. But that was really helpful to me. I was thinking just a lot about how so much of this is based in change and our anxiety about change. So, there's artificial intelligence where just the environment is changing, the sea level's changing, the salination of the ocean, plastics, social changes in terms of manufacturing and how the economy works, and increased inequality. And in the face of all these changes, then you talk about three stories as being possible. One story is the story that things aren't changing, it's kind of, or we can get back to before this change. The second story is, these changes are very dangerous, and they're gonna mean you personally do not have a future, or even worse, maybe your whole people will not have a future. That's the second story. And the third story is a story where, hey, how can we increase the circle of belonging to everyone? And when I read that, I felt like Donald Trump had sometimes a little bit on story number one, make America back the way it was before. Sometimes in story number two, these dangerous people are going to make it so that you're replaced. And then I felt like Barack Obama was kind of like the main exponent for that third story of just like, how do we include everyone? And so maybe you can talk a little bit about just like the cultural moment where, in 2006, 2007, 2008, that feeling of just like, how do we build an inclusive story that's going to include everyone seems so powerful. And that other story now of just about how dangerous the other is seems like it's just got a hold of our soul right now. So what do we do to bring that, that third story, to give it life?
So that was a beautiful encapsulation of my work. And so I appreciate that. I just want to say that. And so part of it is I'll tell you, I spoke at the Democratic Convention when President Obama was being nominated and before he became president. And he was getting the nomination. Stevie Wonder played. It was
I would have wished I could have seen Stevie Wonder.
And I said, so in my talk, I said, there's this disquiet that we need to pay attention to. And I'm one of the people who was helped pushing out the concept of the mind science and implicit bias. Yeah. So this is, a number of years ago. It wasn't part of public discourse. But we could measure implicit bias. We could measure anxiety. And there was this strong sense of anxiety that was in the country that most people, I won't say no one, most people who were on the left were not paying attention to. Yeah. And in fact, if you look at the data, and whenever they publish some data saying by 2045, white people will no longer be in the majority, it's more complicated than that, in fact, but that's what's getting published. Literally, that anxiety ticks up. And I said, so my talk was that, because people were saying, hey, we're coming together, the term that people use is post-racialism, we're finally figured out beyond race. And I said, not quite.
Not quite.
There's some troubling things we have to pay attention to. And I wrote this, years ago, this in another book. I became a pariah. I mean, literally, my friends, we had these seats with where a small number of people were greeting then Senator Obama, and some of my friends were like, and one friend who was still very close said, that was a kind of a downer, John. And we're sort of, and 2 years later, when the Tea Party had exploded on the scene, people started, because I got defunded by funders.
Oh, yeah.
People came back and they said, was this what you were talking about? So part of it, Malcolm, is that even then, people weren't engaging in the way that they should have or could have with the lizard brain. And they weren't, and Trump was.
Yeah.
Trump was already there, sort of beating the drum. It's like,
right, and Barack Obama is not an American citizen,
American,
and really he's a
Muslim,
hidden Muslim. And,
they want all this immigration as a strategy to replace whites. So the Proud Boys, when they're marching in North Carolina, they're literally chanting this German anti-Semitic phrase, Jews will not replace us. And what we did when they said that, right, we said, that's stupid. No one's talking about replacing you. So they're taking when the lizard is expressing itself, we're turning it into a logical argument. Logically, that does not make sense. And there was a lot of stuff that Trump would say or that the right would say that was just so ridiculous, right? Reverend Wright, they said that Obama was a Muslim,
right,
and his minister was a Baptist preacher. It's like, wait a minute, Baptist preachers don't have Muslim congregants? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, right.
But it doesn't make sense up here. What it made sense is back here. What they were saying is he is other. He is other. Doesn't mean he's other because he's had this radical black pastor. He's other because he's Muslim. He's other because he's not American. He's other because he hates white people. If he loves black people, he must hate white people. So all this stuff the foundation was being laid. And our story, to be honest, I think was not robust enough in terms of everybody belongs. What we had, if you think about multiculturalism, for example, what it really says is that you have a culture, you have a culture, you have a culture, you have a culture. It's like there are 50 cultures and we're going to respect all of them. But it doesn't talk about really that all these cultures are in constant interaction with each other. And it does, in a sense, sometimes build on a false notion of those stories. So part of the liberal response, remember the gay marriage issue? What was our response? That gay marriage is just like straight marriage. Right? Nothing's going to change.
Marriage equality.
Yeah, marriage equality. Everything's going to be the same. That they're going to get married and after 20 years, they're not going to have sex either. So what it wouldn't really deal with, what if it does create a change? What if having more immigrants here actually changes America? Which is actually likely to happen. Change happens. So the assurance that liberals were giving people around gay marriage or around immigration was even assimilation. The assimilation is that everything's going to remain the same. We'll assimilate some people who are different. They will change, but we won't. Right? And in some sense, people don't believe that because they look at their neighborhood and they say, no, it's changing. And we, for the most part, didn't have a story that accommodated the change. We didn't say, yes, it's changing. You participate in the change. It's not a zero-sum game where either if we win, they lose. If they win, we lose. Can we imagine a world where we're changing together? And that's the story we're not telling. And of course, there's an advantage, immediate advantage, not a long-term advantage, an immediate advantage when you're telling a story based on fear. Because fear is the oldest emotion. Fear is the lizard brain. So if you're saying, be afraid, it's like, oh, I'm already afraid. And so Trump had an advantage. But we didn't do a good job of curating a story that really brought people together. And we're still struggling with that. And it's been done. I'll just give you one example. Obama, you mentioned, I think he did a fairly decent job. I know him personally, and I can say with some of his advisors, their advice on race was because you're black, you can't touch race. Race becomes the third rail. So it meant there was a conversation happening that, in a sense, after Obama became president, he was muted. Think about the thing when the beer summit. Anyway, the point is that Obama, the advice was avoid it because it's too hard to talk about. Just ignore it. And the right was just boom, 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 really driving that home. That's a lesson that I think we have to learn. For example, in terms of, and I'm not DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. A lot of people is like, well, it's a good practice, but let's just not talk about it. So we concede the ground, the public ground, to one side. That's extremely problematic. So when people we talk about bridging and these other stories, it sounds like, well, look at what's happening. How can you bridge? The country's tearing itself apart. We're more divided anytime since the Civil War. Well, let's go back to the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Except how many people are killing each other?
Yeah.
Do you have hundreds of thousands of casualties at various battles across the country? Yeah, it is a different.
It is a different. And one of the great bridgers in our history is Lincoln.
Yeah.
If I have time, I can pull it up. But Lincoln talks about love. He talks about you're not my enemy. That we love each other. In the middle of the Civil War, he's the president of the North of the United States, and he's talking about loving. So in a sense, this incredible storyteller, this incredible leader, he doesn't shrink away from the Civil War. There's a lot of interesting stuff, but he also creates a container where we can imagine caring about each other, loving each other. And he talks about, and in the Gettysburg Address, he talks about not going back to the past, but going forward. So what he calls for is a new birth of freedom. A new birth of freedom. And out of that came the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, or as Eric Foner would say, a second constitution. So we have examples in our own country of going through struggles, creating a story, and then creating new conditions. The United States became a different country, not a country it should have been after the Civil War. And if Lincoln had lived, we wouldn't be sitting here today.
Yeah.
So we need leadership, and your leadership, leadership at different levels in our workplace, in our schools, but not just advocates for a small we, but advocates for a large we, advocates where everybody belongs. And to not just analytically, but to also tell stories in schools, on television, on movies, so that people who are not going to read my book can actually still feel that. So I think
in sermons, in the books at the West Point Library.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
We have a tradition at this, and we can take questions from the audience.
Sure.
So these are going to be some of the questions. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk about something that I want to talk about the environment again. So you talk about polarization as being a term that describes kind of our current situation or the human condition, and then you contrast that with what you call fragmentation. And polarization is an idea where you have two different sides. And there's this person compromises this way, and this person compromises this way, and through that compromise, you kind of find a middle ground.
Right.
And fragmentation is something different. Could you talk about that a little bit, especially with regard to the environment? I think.
Yes, I mean a lot of people who understand that something's wrong, that we're at each other's throat, and there's different types of polarization. But so polarization, I'm from Berkeley, and one of my colleagues is George Lakoff.
Oh yeah,
Some of
gosh,
you
what a great teacher.
remember his work, and one of his books was "Don't Think of the Elephant."
Yeah, right.
Of course, now you're all thinking about the elephant. But he was saying, how does the brain works? We think in metaphors, so polarization creates a metaphor in the brain, and the idea that you have poles, and the problem are the poles themselves. And so if you have poles, pole A and pole B. It's, first of all, we don't really evaluate them. They're just different poles. They're different extreme. And so the impulse is then to move away from those poles, to move to the center. The problem with that is that it assumes, and you see this in terms of reporting. They say one side said A and the other side said B. We have to find something in the middle. So think about something like slavery. If you have one side saying we should enslave people, another side said we shouldn't, what's the middle? What's the middle ground? We'll enslave half the people? We'll enslave people for part of their lives? If you have a group of people saying that a certain group doesn't belong, blacks, Jews, whatever, and another group saying they do, what's the middle, right? So in a sense, polarization is value neutral. It's position that's what we're concerned about. People are at the extreme positions. And there's no power analysis inherent in the notion of polarization. And it's just like, well, the Democrat says this, the Republican says this, we have to find something in the middle. Well, it depends on what they're saying, right? We want to bomb Venezuela back to the Stone Age. That's what some people are saying, maybe, right? All these generals being called back to the United States. And someone else says, well, no, not to the Stone Age, just to the time when Jesus was around. I mean, so polarization just analytically is not strong.
Yeah.
It's available to us, and it makes it seem like we're neutral, which is not our goal. The goal is not to be neutral. And I got into a little tiff at Berkeley because some of the administration was saying the university, this wonderful university I'm a part of, should be neutral on really important issues. And I said, that's not right. I was the legal director at ACLU, a big fight there when they're saying, when Bork was trying to get on the Supreme Court and people saying, we're neutral. I said, we're not neutral. We represent the Constitution. The Constitution is not a neutral document. When Brown v. Board of Education happened, Wexler, a scholar, wrote a piece saying Brown was not neutral. It sided with black kids against white kids. And then for the next 10 years, there were all these articles about how Brown was not neutral. And the court eventually eviscerated, I'm sorry to take you down this rabbit hole, equal protection by saying you have to be neutral, right? That the equal protection clause is neutral. No, the equal protection clause was trying to end slavery. It was trying to do something substantive. Brown was never designed to be neutral. It wasn't saying you take an integrationist and you take a segregationist. What do you decide to do? How do you develop neutrality out of that? So polarization invites that kind of thinking instead of value-based thinking. Fragmentation basically says that there are different power centers, and people get fragmented around those power centers. Fragmentation says there may be what we call conflict entrepreneurs, people who profit off of conflict. And they're not, and I think Trump is a conflict entrepreneur, and that's what they want to do. So they're not the same as Barack Obama, and you hear that today. Well, the Democrats did, Trump did this. They're not equivalent. There are a lot of polarization invites a number of false equivalents, and not really an analysis of power, position, and values. Fragmentation sort of looks at all of that. So it's a much more robust term. But because polarization is out there, I can see that we have to use the term, but it's just not an exact term.
That's so helpful to me because you're right. It just naturally leads to that kind of false equivalency. That the President Trump was prosecuted by the federal government for crimes, and so we're just doing the same thing and prosecuting.
Comey is just the same.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So here's some questions we have from our audience. How do we change the narrative today, and will it happen before 2027?
What was the part? What about 2027?
How do we change the narrative today, and will it happen before 2027?
Well, supposedly Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard, especially when it's about the future. So here's the thing I would say. I have 3 children, and I used to say to my children growing up that if I could wish them one thing, it would not be happiness, it would not even be good health, it would be engagement. And we don't know the future. What we do know is that we have a role to play. We have to engage. And if we, whatever values, whatever our life work is, to do it. I think the most dangerous aspect of what's happening now is silence. There's a deafening silence from way too many places and way too many people who are supposed to be arbiters of power. So the one reason I get upset with my own university is that I wrote a piece, and in the piece, a short piece, but I said something like, after George Floyd was killed, you had people rushing without giving much thought to adopting programs around race, particularly diversity, equity, and inclusion. But they're just like, it's like we're going to throw some money. Companies saying we're going to write a $100 million project. We're going to fix race, But they didn't think about it. It wasn't reflective. And now you have people rushing to abandon DEI without any reflection.
Yeah.
Right? They're not saying, well, we did a study and we looked at the underlying values and underlying efficacy of this, and we've come to the conclusion that X. All they said is that Trump said it's a bad idea and he's going to punish us if we don't agree with him. We agree with him. We apologize. We made a mistake. So what I'm saying is that I have no problem with critically examining DEI, critically examining implicit bias, critically examining any number of things if it's a real discussion. But a conflict entrepreneur is not inviting a real discussion. Trump's engaged in power politics, bully politics. And so someone needs to stand up and say, not simply we're going to keep our program, whether they think of it, keep it or not, but what it really represents. The reason we actually adopted this, the reason we actually did this is because we think it's right. Now, what about the critique, especially on DEI, that equity was used, DEI was used to other white people? If that's true, it's an important critique. Let's embrace it. Because we're saying not your group and not my group and not your group. We're saying everybody. So we're not picking blacks over whites or Latinos over Asians. We're saying everybody. And to really say that, but we also then have to say that people are not equally situated. So we're not saying we're colorblind. We're not saying we're situation blind. We're not saying we're structurally blind. I use the analogy. I come home from work. One of my children have strep throats. One of them has a bruise where they fell down on the bicycle. So I take the Band-Aid and put it on the kid with strep throat, right? Or I take the Band-Aid and I cut it into 3 because I have 3 kids. And I say, each one of you get a third of the Band-Aid. I treat all my children the same. Yeah. You would say, how stupid is that, right? We're not all situated the same, so we should be treated according to how we're situated. And I've written about that. But my point is that we have to engage, and we have to engage especially because there's a public fight. There's a fight, a cultural fight. It's not just doing work. We have to tell a story of why this work is important. And we should be doing that now. And will we win by 2027? I think we have to redefine what we mean by win. And I can say this, if we don't show up, we've already lost. So we have to speak out. And literally, and I'll share with you, Malcolm, I wrote a piece about Berkeley turning over 160 names to the Trump administration.
Gosh, I couldn't believe that.
And I got emails back. Some emails there were like 3 categories. One was great, wonderful. Another was, you brave man. You still have a job. And the third was, you didn't go far enough, right? But what I'm saying, and there's definitely some stuff happening, right? I mean, the university is tepid in terms of, well, whatever. But if we don't talk, if we don't speak out, and I'm willing to be corrected, but we have to be willing to have a public conversation for values that we really believe in. And for me, that means belonging without othering. Values to say everybody matters, everybody but everybody. And we've done that, and sometimes it creates controversy. So, for example, obviously, what's happening in the Middle East with Gaza. Yeah. We say we absolutely believe that the Jews have a right to exist, but so do Palestinians. So do Palestinians. That's what we are about, and we're going to say it. And it may make some people uncomfortable, and I'm willing to hear the discomfort, but I'm not willing to be silent.
Yeah, that's one of the things I can't believe how we've run out of time. Basically, you've got to get upstairs, and you're going to be a reader for us today. But one of the things that we didn't address at all, but which is so important, is just your explicit decision to take a wider view. So you didn't just say, I'm going to focus on race. You said, othering in general, and that's part of this too. It's just like it's almost a way in which the thought itself is mirroring its own design.
That's right.
But I'm so grateful, for you. I think before we came on, I said, John, I think my life's purpose is to invent a kind of religious life which doesn't depend on making someone else other. So how can you have religion that's just about belonging and not belonging at the expense of othering? But that's what we're here for. And you definitely brought me a lot of steps along the journey, so I'm very grateful for that.
I'm grateful for your work.
Yeah,
Thank you.
definitely. So we have a, thanks. All right, I have my little notes for next week. Please join me at 1:00 p.m. for a discussion of the future of the arts and the regeneration of San Francisco. So this is next week. My guest will be Thomas Campbell of the Fine Arts Museum, So-Young Lee of the Asian Art Museum, Allison Gass of the Institute of Contemporary Art, and Ned Siegel, Chief of Housing and Development for San Francisco. You're always welcome to join us. As I said, John will be one of our readers today at the 11 o'clock service. And we'll also be celebrating my 10th anniversary. So it's the 10th anniversary of my, thanks. Please join me in thanking Professor Powell again. Thank you very much.